From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
The Security Council expresses strong support for the call by international partners and the Secretary General of the United Nations for an immediate and unconditional humanitarian ceasefire.
The United Nations Security Council calls for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza as the Palestinian death toll tops 1,000, including at least 226 children. More than 180,000 people have been displaced.
We want to buy clothes for our children. There are no shops, there's nothing. We have no money for buying because we left our homes with nothing. When we came back to our houses, we found nothing. Complete destruction in Beit Hanun.
We'll speak with Sharif Abdul-Qudus in Gaza City, Professor Ilan Pathé in Haifa, and to Amir Sharab, a Palestinian graduate student at the Monterey Institute of International Studies in California. He's just learned 4 of his cousins have been killed in Khan Yunis in Gaza. In 2009, his 2 brothers were killed in Operation Cast Lead, his father seriously injured. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The UN Security Council's issued a presidential statement calling for an immediate and unconditional humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza as the Palestinian death toll tops 1,000. The weekend saw a series of ceasefire announcements by both Israel and Hamas. On Saturday, more than 130 bodies were pulled from Gaza's rubble during a 12-hour truce. Many displaced residents tried to return home only to find their neighborhoods reduced to rubble. One Gaza resident said the area of Beit Hanun had been totally destroyed.
The human beings are dead, the houses are damaged, the trees are dead, and the livestock is dead as well. So they destroyed the land, the trees, and everything. They totally destroyed it.
Just before the truce took effect, an Israeli strike on a house in Khan Yunis killed 20 people, including 12 members of the same family. After initially rejecting a ceasefire, Hamas on Sunday called for a 24-hour truce to mark the Muslim holiday ending Ramadan. Overall, the Palestinian death toll has now reached 1,031, mostly civilians, including at least 226 children. Israel says 43 of its soldiers have died, along with 3 civilians inside Israel. The United Nations says more than 180,000 Palestinians have been displaced and are living in UN shelters. Secretary of State John Kerry has been intensively involved in an effort to reach a ceasefire. On Friday, the Israeli cabinet rejected Kerry's latest proposal, with Israeli sources calling it too lenient to Hamas demands, including lifting the 7-year blockade of Gaza. The Israeli rejection was issued in private so as not to strain U.S. ties, but at a news conference, Kerry denied Israel had rejected his ceasefire plan, claiming it was never formally proposed.
There was no formal proposal or final proposal or proposal ready for a vote submitted to Israel. Let's make that absolutely crystal clear. And Prime Minister Netanyahu called me a few minutes before this to make it clear that that is in error, inaccurate, and he's putting out a statement to that effect. They may have rejected some language or proposal within a framework of some kind of suggestion at some point in time, but there was no formal proposal submitted from me on which there should have been a vote or which a vote was ripe.
Protests against the Israeli invasion of Gaza continue around the world. On Friday, hundreds rallied in New York City's Times Square.
Make sure that you're sending a message to the U.S. government that you will not allow your taxpayer dollars to kill children in Gaza.
They want us to know that Gaza is not a territory, it is not a prison, it is not a concentration camp, it is where resistance and liberation is born.
We'll have more on Gaza after headlines. Libya is facing its worst period of violence since the toppling of Muammar Gaddafi 3 years ago. More than 150 people have died in Tripoli and Benghazi during 2 weeks of fighting, including 50 people over the weekend. The U.S., the United Nations, and Turkey have removed their diplomats, with the U.S. evacuating its embassy and moving officials to neighboring Tunisia. Escalating violence in eastern Ukraine is hampering efforts to reach the crash site of downed Malaysian Airlines Flight 17. More residents fled to bomb shelters Sunday as government forces clashed with rebel separatists in two major towns. At least 8 civilians were killed. International monitors had reached a deal to visit the crash site in rebel-held territory, but the fighting has kept them away. Alexander Hug of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe's monitoring mission said the fighting has sowed confusion.
The situation has rapidly changed, and as normal in this conflict, the front lines were not very clear. It was a very blurred picture.
Ukraine has seen intensified violence in recent months as the U.S.-backed Kiev government steps up attacks on rebel-held areas. Earlier today, the UN's top human rights official, Navi Pillay, said at least 1,129 people have been killed, over 3,400 wounded since mid-April. Over 200,000 have also been displaced. A spokesperson for Pillay said the downing of Malaysian Airlines Flight 17 may amount to a war crime and warned of increasing abuses in rebel-held areas.
The High Commissioner has indicated this may amount to a war crime. There has been a serious deterioration of the situation in the areas of the East controlled still by these armed groups. This includes abductions, detentions, torture, executions, which are used to intimidate the population, which is often held as hostage or trapped in this pocket of territories in the Donetsk and Luhansk region.
The Ukrainian and U.S. governments say the plane was shot down with Russian missiles supplied to the rebels, a claim Russia and the rebels have denied. The State Department's released satellite imagery, it says, proves Russia has fired into eastern Ukraine and moved heavy artillery across the border. State Department spokesperson Marie Harf said Russia is escalating military aid to the rebels.
New evidence that the Russians intend to deliver heavier and more powerful multiple rocket launchers to the separatist forces in Ukraine, and have evidence that Russia is firing artillery from within Russia to attack Ukrainian military positions.
On Friday, the European Union joined the United States in imposing economic sanctions on Russia, as well as travel bans and assets freezes targeting Russian officials. President Obama hosted Central American leaders at the White House on Friday to discuss the influx of migrant children on the U.S.-Mexico border. Obama met with the presidents of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, the three home countries for the bulk of migrants fleeing violence and poverty. Obama said he warned that those children without valid claims will be deported.
We have to deter a continuing influx of children putting themselves at great risk, and families who are putting their children at great risk. And so I emphasize that within a legal framework and a humanitarian framework and proper due process, children who do not have proper claims and families with children who do not have proper claims at some point will be subject to repatriation to their home countries.
Honduran President Juan Orlando Hernandez says he asked Obama for U.S. help in taking on the root causes of the migrant crisis, including the massive U.S. demand that fuels the Central American drug trade. President Obama has asked Republicans for $3.7 billion to address the migrant crisis, but Republicans have introduced a plan to allocate less than $1 billion. A group of immigrant rights advocates, meanwhile, has announced a picket line at the White House today, quote, unless and until undocumented people are represented at the negotiating table. Argentina is facing a potential default on its sovereign debt if it fails to meet a Thursday deadline. A recent Supreme Court ruling sided with U.S. hedge funds who purchased Argentina's debt for bargain prices after its financial crisis and then refused to cut the value of their holdings, as most other creditors did. A lower court judge then barred Argentina from repaying the majority of its creditors without also repaying the so-called vulture funds led by billionaire Paul Singer's NML Capital. The Argentine government says it's impossible to fully repay the vulture funds, risking the country's second default in 13 years. At a protest in Buenos Aires, demonstrators back the government's refusal to pay the vulture funds.
We don't propose to go in default. We decided that it's a sovereign decision not to pay. We paid the IMF, we paid the Vulture Funds, we paid the International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes, and we paid the Paris Club, and on top of this, they will declare a default. This is why we decided not to pay.
And a former Venezuelan general has avoided extradition to the United States. Hugo Carvajal was detained in Aruba last week at the request of the U.S., which sought to try him on drug charges. But the Venezuelan government won Carvajal's freedom after citing his diplomatic immunity. A U.S. indictment accused him of helping drug traffickers. The Venezuelan government says the warrant was politically motivated. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In an emergency midnight meeting, the United Nations Security Council called for an immediate and unconditional humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza early this morning as the Palestinian toll topped 1,000 since the Israeli offensive began 21 days ago. UN Security Council President Eugene Kasana of Rwanda made the announcement.
The Security Council expresses strong support for the call by international partners and the Secretary General of the United Nations for an immediate and unconditional humanitarian ceasefire, allowing for delivery of urgently needed assistance, and they urged all parties to accept and fully implement the humanitarian ceasefire into the Eid period and beyond.
The weekend saw a series of ceasefire announcements by both Israel and Hamas. On Saturday, more than 130 bodies were pulled from the rubble in Gaza during a 12-hour truce. Just before the truce took effect, an Israeli strike on a house in Khan Yunis killed 20 people. According to the Los Angeles Times, the dead included 12 members of a family sheltering there from fighting in the nearby village of Huza. On Sunday, Hamas called for a 24-hour truce to mark the Muslim holiday of Eid al-Fitr. Overall, the Palestinian death toll has now reached 1,035, mostly civilians, including at least 226 children. Israel says 43 of its soldiers have died, along with 2 Israeli civilians and 1 Thai farm worker. According to the United Nations, more than 180,000 Palestinians have been displaced and are now living in UN shelters. Last week, 16 Palestinians died at a UN shelter when it came under fire. On Sunday, Israel acknowledged for the first time its troops had fired a mortar shell that hit the courtyard of the UN shelter, but it still denies carrying out the deadly attack. For more on Gaza, we go to Gaza City, where we're joined by Democracy Now! Correspondent Sharif Abdel-Quddus. Sharif, can you talk about what is happening right now in Gaza?
Well, Amy, as we talk of an ongoing ceasefire, there is some shelling that's continuing, not the brutal bombardment that has been happening for almost 3 weeks now, but shelling really restricted to some areas in the north, as well as in the east and in the south. 4 people have been killed today, including a child. They've also pulled at least 7 bodies out of Khuza in the south. So an area that has been unreachable by even the Red Cross and ambulances until today. This comes after a weekend in which, as you mentioned, a 12-hour humanitarian truce was first agreed on Saturday, and this allowed thousands of people to return to their homes for the first time in the areas like Shijaiya and Beit Hanun. We went to both on Saturday, and in Beit Hanun, a town in the northeast of the Gaza Strip, close to the Israeli border, the destruction was total. No building was left untouched by Israel's bombardment. There was just mounds of rubble where buildings once stood. There was dead horses lying on the streets, stiff with rigor mortis. Even color had been erased, and everything was covered in a gray cement dust, and it was like a monochromatic wasteland. People were walking around, not even recognizing where their homes once were. Really just mounds of rubble, twisted rebar and concrete where there was a 5-story building. People were trying to salvage anything they could from their homes. Many couldn't even get anything out. They had fled under bombardment with only the clothes on their backs, and they couldn't retrieve anything. And there was evidence in Beit Hanun of the Israeli invasion everywhere. You could see the tank treads of the Israeli tanks and where the road had been ripped up by the heavy armor that had rolled into Beit Hanun. In one house, a 20-year-old resident named Mustafa al-Masri showed us his house, which was still standing, but had been raided and ransacked by Israeli soldiers. We saw mattresses on the floor. We saw bullet casings all over the roof, 2 shoulder-mounted rocket launchers on the roof where they had presumably engaged in some kind of battle with militants. And there was, other things like bottled water and mosquito spray with Hebrew writing on it. They also arrested people from their homes. One resident told me that Israeli soldiers raided his home, separated the men and the women, then blindfolded and arrested him, his uncle, and 3 cousins, took them across the border into Israel and interrogated them for 2 days about what he called the resistance. And then he said he was dumped back on the Erez crossing. He couldn't get back to his home in Beit Hanun, which was under heavy shelling, for 3 days, and didn't know where the rest of his family was. Both his grandparents, his 2 younger brothers, aged 12 and 13, his sister and his niece, and he had gone back to his house and found what he said was 5 floors had become 1. There was a smell of death that was coming out of the house. He was hoping that that wasn't their bodies that he was smelling. He was trying to find them. So this was the kind of scene, the kind of bombardment that Israel had left behind. In Shijaiya, the neighborhood east of Gaza City, we witnessed similar scenes of devastation. People had gone there to try and again salvage what they could from their homes, and you saw just by midday, the truce started at 8 a.m. and by midday there was just residents pouring again out of Shijaiya, carrying the little that they could get from their homes. You saw mattresses piled atop cars and people carrying clothes on donkey carts, and a bystander told me this looks like the second Nakba. That's the Arabic for catastrophe, the term that Palestinians use to describe the forced expulsion of hundreds of thousands during the forming of Israel in 1948. So really difficult scenes, and people using bulldozers and other heavy equipment to dig bodies out of the rubble. And people are still missing now. I just came back from, as I said, Khuzaa, where 7 bodies had been pulled out. And it's a very uneasy truce, an uneasy ceasefire, and people are waiting to see if the bombs will start falling again.
Sharif, over the weekend, CBS's Charlie Rose interviewed Hamas leader Khaled Mashal, who called for an end to Israel's occupation of Gaza.
This is not a prerequisite. Life is not a prerequisite. Life is a right for our people in Palestine. Since 2006, when the world refused the outcomes of the elections, our people actually lived under the siege of 8 years. This is a collective punishment. We need to lift the siege. We have to have a port. We have to have an airport. This is the first message. The second message, in order to stop the bloodletting, we need to look at the underlying causes. We need to look at the occupation. We need to stop the occupation. Netanyahu doesn't take heed of our rights. Mr. Kerry, months ago, tried to find a window through the negotiations in order to meet our target, to live without occupation, to reach our state. Netanyahu has killed our hope, killed our dream, and he killed the American initiative.
Sharif, that was Hamas leader Khaled Mashal. Can you respond to what he's saying? What about these truces and the calls for the ceasefire?
Well, I mean, I also spoke to several Hamas officials over the weekend about the ceasefire. It seems what Israel is trying to do, or what is doing, is trying to call truce after truce and kind of wind down the conflict without addressing any of the key Palestinian conditions, any of the key Palestinian demands, which include, first and foremost, a lifting of the blockade that has strangled the Gaza Strip and is in effect causing these repeated conflicts, 3 of which we've had in the last 6 years alone. So essentially bringing back the whole situation to square one. And when you speak to people, you speak to Hamas officials, but also just Palestinians in Gaza, they say that after all this death, after all this destruction, after all this displacement, that they're going to go back to the same situation they had before this latest conflict, which was extremely dire. We have to remember Israel has put, and Egypt as well, has put a blockade on Gaza since 2007. There was tunnels going into Egypt where many many goods were being brought in, basic goods, construction materials, that both Mubarak and Mohammed Morsi, who were the second Egyptian president, really turned a blind eye to. And the Rafah border was closed, the crossing, but it was somewhat open. But ever since the overthrow of Mohammed Morsi by Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the current president of Egypt, who really did a very harsh clampdown on the Muslim Brotherhood and paints Hamas as a terrorist group that is allied with the Muslim Brotherhood, people say that things here have become unbearable. Nearly all of the tunnels were destroyed. The Rafah crossing was almost completely sealed, and life became extremely difficult for Palestinians here. And this is partly a result of that. And so for people to go back after this conflict to that same situation, I think is unacceptable, both for Palestinian people, but also for Hamas as a political movement, which is really fighting for its life if it comes out with nothing from this conflict.
On Sunday, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu accused Hamas of violating its own offer of a 24-hour humanitarian truce in Gaza. He was speaking to David Gregory on Meet the Press.
You know, we've accepted 5 ceasefires, acted upon them. Hamas has rejected every single one of them, violated them, including 2 humanitarian ceasefires, which we accepted and implemented in the last 24 hours. Now Hamas is suggesting a ceasefire, and believe it or not, David, they've even violated their own ceasefire. So they continue to fire at us.
That was Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Sharif, can you respond?
Well, Israel is shelling today. I can hear it right now in different parts. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, they killed 4 people today, including a boy who was just buried. So, and when we talk about ceasefire, we're also talking about conditions where Israeli tanks and troops are still on the ground inside Gaza, still continuing with their declared objective, which is to find and destroy tunnels. So when you speak to many people about the ceasefire, they say it's not a ceasefire. Israeli troops are in Gaza and continuing with their ground offensive and their ground operations. And there was kind of a game almost played with calling for a ceasefire, where Israel and Hamas agreed initially to this 12-hour ceasefire, and then Israel extended by 4 hours, and then by another 24. Hamas rejected that, and then Hamas called its own 24-hour ceasefire, because I think Hamas wants to seem as if Israel is not the only one that can call the shots, that it can't start the wars and end them whenever it feels like it. So it wants to feel like a player in the process also. Right now, this latest ceasefire was supposed to expire at 2 p.m. It's now 3. We hear shelling. Israel has said that it won't accept the ceasefire, but it will respond to any fire from Hamas. So it's a very uneasy situation right now. As I'm speaking to you, I can hear heavier booms in the distance that we haven't heard for the past couple of days. So things may be coming apart. Hopefully, we won't return to the brutal bombardment that Gaza has been under, that has killed over 1,000 people, mostly civilians, as you mentioned, over 200 children. And just to describe the massive displacement, only about 10% of Gaza is displaced. When you walk around Gaza City, you just see people in parks, you see them in unfinished buildings. Shifa Hospital is a refugee camp. Most of them are from Shija'iyya. Today is the first day of Eid, which is a Muslim holiday. It's supposed to be a time of celebration. It's now really a time of mourning. People are trying to bury their dead. They don't have the money to buy the clothes that they usually do for their children on Eid. And so it's a very difficult time for Palestinians in Gaza.
And Sharif, the buzzing that we're hearing behind you, in addition to the explosions, do you know what that is?
Well, the buzzing is an ever-present sound in Gaza. It's the sound of the drones overhead, surveillance drones. Some of them are attack drones that are always there. Even when the shelling stops and the bombardment stops, you always hear the drones. And it's really part of the... It's very hard psychologically, because it's an ever-present noise, and you kind of feel that you're being watched all the time. And also today, our driver and journalists working with us, Palestinians, said they received robocalls, automated calls today. with threats from the Israeli military. One of them saying, you know, you terrorists, you hear that plane overhead, you're the target. And another one at a house that said, oh, terrorists, you hear the sound of this tank, and then the sound of a loud boom. So there's also an element of psychological warfare that is being played on Palestinians in Gaza that is ongoing.
Sharif, I want to thank you for being with us. Stay safe. Democracy Now! Correspondent in Gaza City. We will link to your stories at thenation.com. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. When we come back, we speak to a Palestinian graduate student here in the United States. He just got word that 4 of his cousins, 1 first cousin, 3 second cousins, had been killed in Khan Yunis. We last talked to him in 2009 when his father and 2 brothers were in a car fleeing from their village in Operation Cast Lead, as Israel call it. His 2 brothers were killed. His father was seriously injured. We'll be back in a minute. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're joined right now by Amr Sharab, a Palestinian graduate student from Khan Yunis in the Gaza Strip. He's studying at the Monterey Institute of International Studies in California. He has just learned that 4 of his cousins have died in Khan Yunis. We last spoke to him 5 years ago. It was shortly after he lost his 2 brothers during Israel's assault on Gaza, known as Operation Cast Lead. In 2009, January, his dad and 2 brothers were fleeing their village when their vehicle came under Israeli fire. His brother, 28-year-old Kassab, died in a hail of bullets trying to flee the vehicle. His other brother, Ibrahim, 18 years old, survived the initial attack, but Israeli troops refused to allow an ambulance to reach him and his father until 20 hours later. By then it was too late. Ibrahim had bled to death in front of his father. Amr Sharab has been recounting the story of his brothers and other Palestinians at college campuses and community gatherings across the United States, and it was just recently that he learned about his cousins in Khan Yunis. We welcome you back to Democracy Now! I'm sorry under such sad circumstances. My condolences to you and your family, Amr. Can you talk about what you've just learned?
Thank you, Amy, for having me again, and I wish next time we meet we'll be under better circumstances. So last week, actually, last Tuesday, I got news from Gaza via a friend that my cousin, Mohammed Taysir, was killed. He was targeted by one of those drones that Sharif was talking about. He was visiting some friends. He was left their house at 1 a.m., started walking home, and on the walk home he was directly targeted by a drone. A couple hours later, actually, the house of the friends that he was visiting was bombed by the Israeli Air Force, and it killed 2 and injured several other people. His dad, because those friends are their neighbors, his dad went to visit, ran to the house of the neighbors, the friends, to help evacuate the wounded in fear of the house being bombed again. And the dad was looking for Mohammed, his eldest son, his 22-year-old eldest son, and was looking for him to help. couple hours later, once lights started coming out, people saw a body on the street that they realized was Muhammad's.
How old was Muhammad?
22.
How old was Taseer?
Taseer is in his 50s. I'm 55 now.
And you had 2 other cousins?
3 cousins, 3 brothers, 3 second cousins. On Wednesday, their house in the Sheikh Nasser region in Khan Yunis was bombed by the Israeli Air Forces. A four-story house was flattened to the ground. Initial news that there were 3 people killed and several wounded. Then we got news later that no one was hurt, and then the next morning, Thursday morning, they extracted the body of Iyad, and then the next morning, during the 12-hour ceasefire, they had more time to dig through the rubble and found 2 more bodies of his brothers, 2 of his brothers, and they were all recently married. All 3 of them got married either last year or the year before.
Now, we last talked in 2009. You had just graduated from Middlebury College in Vermont. This was the period of Operation Cast Lead, as the Israeli military called it, when more than 1,400 Palestinians were killed. Describe what happened to your brothers and your dad.
Well, Amy, my dad and brothers were in our farm in the Bukhari region, and they were driving home during the ceasefire, the humanitarian lull that Israel announced, and they waited till the middle of that ceasefire. They were driving home. They drove for about half a kilometer or a kilometer. They faced a tank on the side of the road. They were waved through by the tank. And then once they drove a couple hundred meters past it, Israeli soldiers stationed in a civilian house, they occupied a civilian house and took at least 11 residents as hostages in that house. They opened fire on them indiscriminately.
On your father and
on the
car?
Yes, my dad was hit while driving. They hit a wall. The car came to a halt. They ordered them to get out of the car. As Kassab, who was in the passenger seat, got out, he was shot. Later we realized he had 18 bullets across his chest, his stomach, and his arms. My dad got out and he ducked by the car. My brother Ibrahim, who was in the back seat, got out, and he was also shot in his left leg, under the knee. Initially, they wouldn't allow my dad or Ibrahim to call an ambulance or even to check on Kassab's body. They had no idea what happened to him. That was around 1
it was just feet away.
Yeah, a few feet away, yeah, a few feet, like on the other side of the car, basically. And they wouldn't let him check on them. My dad only confirmed Kassab's death about 5 hours later, after sunset, when he saw cats nibbling on his body. He challenged the soldiers' orders not to move, challenged the rounds they fired around him, checked on Kassab, realized he was dead, and covered his face with his jacket and crawled back next to Ibrahim. They were pinned next to the car for about 24 hours. Ibrahim passed away. Shooting happened around 1 p.m. Ibrahim passed away around midnight, and ambulances were not allowed through.
How do you know this?
My dad wrote an account of that ordeal, of that whole story, from his hospital bed. He wrote it the day after, and over 2 days, because he wanted remembered, he wanted memorized. When I first reached him over his cell phone, once he got to the hospital, he told me, tell people what happened to us. Tell them what happened to us. Your brothers don't deserve this. Everyone needs to know about this.
Your uncle had tried to get an ambulance?
Yes.
How did he know anything was going on?
Later, they allowed my dad to use his cell phone, and he called my uncle, and my uncle reached the area with an ambulance. They would not allow them through. And it's not only my uncle. My dad was on phone calls throughout the night to local press, to international media, to local international human rights organizations, to Israeli human rights organizations. He was talking with everyone, and in vain. Throughout that night, once I got the news, we were talking to everyone. We reached members of the Israeli Knesset. We tried to contact the Obama transition team. We contacted everyone. People in all 5 continents were making calls, trying to reach people to get them help, but it was in vain. It wasn't until 7 a.m. the next day, the 17th, they were shot on the 16th. On 7 a.m.
This was January.
Yes, 2009. 7 a.m. we got a word through a member of the Knesset, a Palestinian member of the Knesset that we reached, that the Israeli army would allow an ambulance to go in, but only at noon, when the humanitarian ceasefire would start for the next day. And the soldiers were watching them all that time. They refused to give them a bandage. They refused to give them anything to stop the bleeding. They refused to give them a sip of water, a blanket, nothing. My brother Ibrahim was shivering next to my dad, and they wouldn't do anything other than curse at them, laugh at them, and watch them suffer. Later on, we found that they left graffiti on the wall of the house that said Kahana was right.
Referring to?
Meir Kahana, the extremist Israeli rabbi who called for the killing or transfer of all Arabs and Palestinians from Palestine and Israel to other nations to make Israel a purely Jewish state.
I wanted to get your response to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who was speaking to CNN's Wolf Blitzer last week, saying that Hamas is intentionally endangering Palestinian civilians in hopes that the gruesome images will turn the international community against Israel.
All civilian casualties are unintended by us, but actually intended by Hamas. They want to pile up as many civilian dead as they can, because somebody said they use, I mean, it's gruesome, they use telegenically dead Palestinians for their cause. They want the more dead, the better.
That was Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Your response to this, Amr?
Oh, well, first of all, I want to jump on that phrase, telegenically dead. I hear that phrase, and I really want to throw up. This is just despicable description of dead children, women. That's what you call them. Instead of saying condolences, instead of saying we're sorry, you say telegenically dead. This is extremely offensive to start with. And then to Prime Minister Netanyahu and all the Israeli spokespersons in Arabic and English and Hebrew and every language, they say they use precision bombs. They say they use smart weapons, and they pinpoint their attacks, and several Israeli spokespeople said every attack has hit its intended target, and now we know what are the intended targets. It's children, it's families, it's women. An Israeli reserve general said, we're going to kill their families so they learn not to come back again. An Israeli professor at Bar Ilan University said, kill them, kill their kids, rape their women, kill their children, so they learn. An Israeli member of the Knesset, who is a member of the ruling coalition, wrote a posting on Facebook that they received several thousand likes, calling for the extermination of Palestinians, killing all their kids, killing the mothers who give birth to those snakes. So what Israel says, and we know that Israel repeatedly has used the claim that Palestinians use human shields. That claim has been discredited over and over and over again by the Goldstone Report, by the UN, by all the respectable human rights organizations. organizations. On the contrary, there is plenty of proof, plenty of evidence that Israel uses Palestinians as human shields. As I know it personally in the case of my family and my brothers, where they were occupying a house holding the local residents as human shields. The UNICEF about 3 months ago issued a report documenting Israel's use of children as human shields. That was incorporated by recently by a report for, I believe, the UN Initiative for Children. That's also documented Israel's use of human shields. So Israel is deliberately targeting civilians. It's from the day one of this attack. They have been bombing houses, wiping entire families to try to scare people into submission.
The Knesset member that you referred to, Ayelet Shaked,
yes,
with the Jewish Home Party, who wrote that on her Facebook page, saying that the killing should include the mothers of the martyrs, saying that they should go, as should the physical homes in which they raise the snakes, saying because they give birth to the little snakes. Here you are in the United States. How are you dealing with all of what has happened in not only the last few weeks, but of course because your two brothers were killed in 2009? You went to Middlebury College. We saw you just after that at Operation Cast Lead. Now you're in California at Monterey, a graduate student.
Well, there are two facets to it. On one side, the U.S. government is a full partner in the murder of Palestinians, including my brothers. The United States provides over $3 billion of direct military aid to Israel annually. The Congress is just approved or in the process of approving an additional $600 million in military aid to Israel. They tagged on to the bill, the immigration bill, for dealing with undocumented children. They tagged on about $225 million in additional aid for the Iron Dome in Israel. And the U.S. provides blank backing to Israel in the UN, in the Security Council, everywhere. Although we know sometimes it goes against the U.S. stances. Israel just rejected the American initiative for a ceasefire, and Secretary Kerry retracted and said, "Oh, we never offered them an initiative." Secretary Kerry, have some courage, have some integrity. You had a hot mic moment that showed what you really felt about it. How about you show it and say it in a scheduled meeting as opposed to a hot mic moment?
Explain what you mean for those who aren't familiar with that moment in the Fox studio.
Secretary Kerry, when he was appearing, I believe last Sunday, when he was appearing on the different Sunday shows, he was on Fox preparing to appear on their Sunday morning show.
Actually, we have a clip of that. So this was one of the comments he made on this round of the network talk shows to publicly defend Israel's assault on Gaza, but in a private phone call that was caught on camera in between commercial breaks, Kerry appeared to speak sarcastically about the massive civilian toll and the attacks. He was speaking to an aide on his speakerphone on his cell phone.
Yeah. It's a hell of a pinpoint operation. It's a hell of a pinpoint operation.
Right. It's escalating significantly, and it just underscores the need for ceasefire.
We've got to get over there.
Yep.
Thank you, John. I think, John, we ought to go tonight. I think it's crazy to be sitting around.
That was John Kerry in Fox's studio. That's not on the air, although they recorded it and then played it for him on Fox to respond to.
And then he tried to backtrack the comment, and then he went to Israel and repeated the same talking points about Israel having the right to defend itself. Yes, Israel does have the right to defend itself, as does every nation and every people, including the Palestinian people, who have been under occupation since 1967, and we in in Gaza have been living under a terrible siege since 2007, but we don't hear Secretary Kerry talk about this, at least not in public.
What does that siege mean to you in daily life?
That siege and blockade of Gaza that has been implemented by Israel against Gaza Strip since 2007, that has been at its strictest form. But Gaza has been suffering from one degree or another since the occupation in 1967. But that siege, what it means, it shuts down all of Gaza's borders and crossings, most of them with Israel, with only one with Egypt. That's also shut down by the Egyptian authorities. Israeli warships and boats in the sea, and airplanes and drones in the sky. That means they ration everything that comes in and out, from food to medicine, to pens and papers and pencils, construction material, gas, natural gas, potato chips, cardamom, chocolate, and it's all for security concerns. I know people who have died because the chemotherapy they required for their cancer treatment was not allowed in. People who have died because the dialysis, spare parts for a dialysis machine they required for their kidney condition were not allowed in. I know people who have lost very lucrative and full scholarships in some top universities because they were not allowed out. I know people, ambulances that couldn't run to retrieve victims because they didn't have gas.
How do you respond to the Israeli military saying they're moving into Gaza to destroy the maze of tunnels because they're used to smuggle in weapons?
The tunnels have been used until recently, until they have been practically fully destroyed by the Egyptian authorities. They have been used primarily as a commercial avenue. It has been used as a venue for trade, getting goods in and out of Gaza, or primarily into Gaza, and allowing people to get in and out of Gaza. My brother, for instance, my brother's in-laws managed, 2 years ago, they managed to go to Gaza for the first time in over 30 years through one of the tunnels. That's the only way. If all the official crossings are closed, if the Israeli government wants to put the Palestinians on a diet, an Israeli government official said, we are going to put the Palestinians on a diet. They were allowing, Gisha, an Israeli human rights organization, revealed that, and they were calculating, cynically calculating, 2,000 calories per day per person of food to be allowed in. So people do not starve, but just barely survive. The tunnels came and helped change some of that. The tunnels were primarily used, as I said, to let people in and out, and then to get everything in, from cars to gas to construction materials. After the so-called Operation Cast Lead, tens of thousands of houses were destroyed.
Do you think, do you believe that the Israeli military is bombing Gaza because of Hamas and the other groups firing thousands of rockets into Israel?
Well, Amy, over the past 2 years, there have been virtually no rockets coming out of Gaza. And Israel continued to siege Gaza and blockade Gaza. And that siege is a form of slow death. People are saying we can either die quickly now or we die slowly through the siege and the blockade. If I'm a father and I cannot get a life-saving medicine for my kid because of that siege, how am I going to feel? What am I going to do? There were no rockets before 2001. Israel continued to occupy Gaza. There were no rockets in the 90s and the 80s. Israel continued to occupy Gaza and kill Palestinians.
We're going to have to leave it there. We're going to turn in a moment to the Israeli historian Ilan Pappé speaking to us from Haifa. My condolences again to you and your family. And I want to thank you very much for being with us. I'm so sorry under these circumstances.
Thank you so much, Amy, for the wonderful work you do every day.
Amr Sharab is a graduate student at the Monterey Institute for International Studies in California. He graduated from Middlebury College. He is from Khan Yunis in Gaza. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back in a moment.
Draw a line in the sand in Iraq and Iran, the British in Sudan, at home Americans, driving your sedans past the ghetto, line between the urban, the suburban, the turban on his head drew the line between the pastor and the priest, then the beast was released from the other side, no defense mechanism, build a prison, build a wall, Berlin, then fall, then call on the king's horses and men to amend, bend, then break rules, Palestinians, Jews, globally confused, Gaza stripping abuse to use fools as tools, then give fools the tools. Locally abused, street wars and news, lines skewed in hues, pop rules and blues. Draw a line and chose to jump the fence, and I've been flying ever since. Come on, it's separate but equality. Savvy reppin' ISD, neon and free radical music, we can all agree.
Landmines line borders and landlines. Demilitarized zones span through man's rise and demise. Again and again the pride proceeds destruction and genocide.
Every wall by the free radicals. Here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report.